Hello and welcome to Dig Deeper. My name is John March, and it's wonderful to be back after a little bit of a break. Every so often in leadership, we need a bit of a rest. But one of the things I've missed has been these Thursday conversations, albeit that this is pre-recorded over Easter. We're trying to cover a lot, but it's good to be back. Stephen, welcome back.
We didn't even notice you were gone. Sean and I are having so much fun. We're just chatting forever.
Sean is a more than adequate substitute. In fact, I'm substituting in for her now.
Yeah, so we need to find ways to get her involved more regularly, for sure.
Yeah, it's been great to have Sean. I just want a massive shout out to her. That's not something that she's not on the staff of St. Luke's, but as a volunteer. So I'm passionate about theology and applying it to our lives in our regular walk with Jesus. And I'm so grateful that she has been involved, but will continue to in the near future. Well, it's great to be back. And we are whistling through. We've got 3 sessions, and we're going to try and cover 4 chapters together.
Now,
and
the last one is kind of half a chapter, so it will be all right.
Yeah, we'll be fine.
3 sessions for 3.5 chapters.
Exactly. So we're going to cover chapter 13 in this one, and tune into the other episodes later for chapter 14, which covers what we're covering in Maundy Thursday, chapter 15, Good Friday, chapter 15 and 16 for Good Friday and Easter Day.
It's a great place to stop, actually. That's a perfect place to stop.
Yeah. And by then we will have covered the entirety of Mark's Gospel.
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
That's pretty good.
So let's begin, Stephen. Time is of the essence. We want to do these well. They're going to be a bit shorter than usual because we have a lot to cram in. So we're going to look at chapter 13.
I don't think normally we read it, but I don't think we should read the whole chapter. Do you? Should we just go through the verses that jump out at us?
Yeah. Okay.
That would take a lot of time, and we don't need to read the whole.
So if you're at home listening to this, grab Mark
chapter
13. Stephen has a different version in front of him. He's got the Common English version. That's what he'll be referring to. And I have David Bentley Hart's version of the New Testament. And we're going to read this as we go along. Stephen, why don't you lead us? Where do we start first?
Well, the last time with Sean, we were talking about the poor old widow who gave her last coins to the temple. And if you remember, I've said to you before, and I was talking to Sean, like, we often talk about that as if it's like this really pro give all your money to the church kind of passage, and actually it's the opposite. It begins that story, the top of the story is Jesus saying, watch out for the scribes, they devour widows' houses in order to pay for their finery. Then along comes a widow and she gives all her money, and then Jesus says, she's given all her money, look what she's just done. And then they go outside, and then in chapter 13, then the disciples, immediately following that story, then the disciples go, hey, Jesus, look at these temples. Look at this wonderful stone building that has just been paid for by the widows. Like, this house has devoured widows' offerings. Mm-hmm. And Jesus says, do you see these buildings? Not a single stone will be left one on the other. This whole story cycle is one of quite pointed critique of the temple apparatus and all the people who are earning their living off of it. It's not this endorsement of it. It's actually a prediction that one day that system is going to crash.
Yeah. One of the things I love about the way Jesus brings things up is he's so visual. You know, he's got these visual aids behind him.
Yeah.
You know, this isn't a conversation in a closed room.
Yeah.
The temple is there.
Yeah.
The widow is there.
Yeah. They're pointing at them. And
this thing that you're revering.
Yeah.
This very thing that is at the center of your community is going to come crashing down.
It's not theoretical to them. They're standing in its shadow when he says it, you know. So then then they say, well, when's this going to happen? When you predict the temple to be totally collapsed, you're also predicting that the whole system around it, the whole culture around it, is also going to be changed, which is another way of saying that would be the end of the world, which is where chapter 13 is known as the eschatological or apocalyptic chapter in Mark. and it has similar language to the book of Revelation, for example.
Okay.
So that this temple story leads straight into Jesus predicting the end of the age, or sometimes in English we call it the end of the world, but it's not really the end of the world. Apocalyptic language doesn't mean the end of the world, it means the end of an age.
Like an era.
The end of an era. And the other thing about apocalyptic language is that in the Jewish imagination is that the end of one era always also means the beginning of a new one, right? So it's not just the destruction. And Jesus will use the language here, and he uses it all the time. It's like a woman giving birth. So that's apocalyptic, because the pains are bringing an end to one stage of her life, but they're bringing the beginning to a whole new stage of life. And that's what apocalyptic is. And the book of Revelation is the same. It's not the end of all creation. It's the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. And here, Mark 13, it's very similar.
And so he's saying this temple, everything around it will collapse. Now, let's give a bit of context to the temple before we get into what that might mean. So this is the temple, if I'm right, that Solomon built. Is that right? Or is this...
No, King Herod built this one. The Solomon one had been destroyed.
Okay.
The one that they're all looking at was built by King Herod.
Okay. So how long had that been part of the fabric of this particular society then?
A generation or so, I think.
So not that long?
No. And it was built as a way to demonstrate King Herod's legitimacy as the king of the Jews, which was the phrase he used for himself, which is significant that was the phrase that Jesus had eventually over his cross. Yeah. So he was like a rival to King Herod in some way. Right, to challenge the temple is to challenge King Herod as well, right?
Right. And I forget that King Herod is laying claim in that regard to that role within Jewish, because you think of him always in opposition. You think of him as opposite to, in terms of how his whole lineage. Of course, you got King Herod, who oversaw Jesus's or the killing of the infants at Jesus' birth. Yeah. Then you got a different Herod, haven't you? That killed John the Baptist and is here now.
He refers to them all as King Herod because it's like Herod, his son, and then the grandson.
Yeah.
I think it was Herod Senior that built the temple, but the whole thing is just kind of one unbroken line of bad King Herods, to be honest.
Yeah.
And they're all laying claim to the same kind of idea, and they're just seen as the New Testament almost isn't that interested in differentiating them, although it does recognize there's a difference. But it's more like, well, who's the Herod today? Oh, it's Herod Agrippa. Oh, well, he's still somebody who's trying to put himself up, running the country, who still sees himself as the king of the Jews. He's still corrupt. He's still in the pocket of Rome, Rome, all that kind of stuff. But then the temple is also it's also connected to the idea. A lot of this language we're going to see here is connected to the idea of the redemption of Israel, or the restoration of Israel. So when you're looking forward to the end of one era and the beginning of a new one, and you are a Roman occupied Palestinian Jew, what you're looking forward to is Exodus, and you're looking for the Romans to be broken, the Gentile era to end, and the new era to come, and the Israel to be restored. That's what you're looking for. Think back to in Exodus in Egypt, and how the moon, the water turns to blood, and the frogs come out of the sky, and the eldest sons all die. End of the world kind of stuff is happening all around Israel being redeemed from the Egyptians. So this kind of imagery and language is always associated with this idea of being restored. And this is what happens, and then the Hebrew scriptures do this a lot. Different prophets use apocalyptic language. Daniel is the most famous one.
Yeah.
And then Jesus comes along, and so when he's saying this kind of stuff, it's not like crashingly new. He's using a form of language which people recognize. Okay, you are talking about the end of an era and the release of something new.
Yeah, but it's not what they expect.
But he's now the agent of that. He's saying he's the one.
Yeah.
And then many people are going to come and do this. You're going to hear wars and rumors of wars. Don't be alarmed. These things must happen, but it isn't the end yet. So nations will rise against nations. There'll be an earthquake and famines. These things are just the beginning of the birth pangs. There's the birth language.
Yeah.
And it's Jesus through Mark. Well, Mark, I always remember that there's like a pastoral thing here, like the Mark's original audience, the Mark Church, or whoever it is, the group of believers. They are themselves living in a time of persecution. They're living in a time when they're living in the 70s and 80s, and the Jews have been kicking them out of synagogues. The Romans have been persecuting them. They've been leaving their families or being kicked out of their families because of their association with Jesus and the Jesus movement. So there's a sense that being persecuted and feeling like it's the end of the world is a live issue for Mark's people.
Yeah. And
so Mark is saying, hey, remember that Jesus talked about this.
Yeah.
Puts it in. So there's two things going on. Jesus talking about it in the AD 30s and Mark's people reading it in the AD 70s and 80s. And those are both important.
And has the temple by this point, historically, has it fallen at this point?
Yeah, well, this is one of those things that we can date the book of Mark, actually, because the temple gets destroyed in AD 70.
Yeah.
And Mark doesn't mention that specifically. So Mark has quite a lot of times where he'll put in brackets. He'll explain things. So he'll say, oh, Jesus did this to explain because the Pharisees do this. Or later on when Jesus is coming up, actually, he's going to say, when you see the abomination that causes desolation, then Mark will put in brackets, let the reader understand. And Mark's quite happy to put himself into the text. He'll do these little asides to the reader, right?
Yeah.
He doesn't do it for the temple. So a very good place he could have done it was when Jesus says, do you see these stones? Not one stone will be left on top of another. And it would have been fully within Mark's style to say bracket, let the reader understand. Yeah. It happened, close bracket, but he doesn't, which helps us to think it's quite likely that Mark was written down before AD 70, right? Because if it was written down after AD 70, there's no reason on earth why he wouldn't have said, look, it happened. The temple really did get destroyed.
Yeah.
But the temple is like it's either been just destroyed and it's so obvious that Mark doesn't have to tell you, or it's about to be. So all the unrest that led to the Jews revolting and then the Romans destroying the temple, that actually took a span of about 4 years. So from about 66 to 70, it was like a long simmering revolution. And it was in the AD 70 that the Romans finally had enough. But in that mid-60s period, it was really ratcheting up. And there was this kind of call that all the loyal sons of Israel will come back to the homeland to defend the homeland. And so there would be a pastoral element here for Mark's people, because they would have thought of themselves as Jewish. And they also would have thought, should we be going back to defend the homeland? Should we be taking up arms to kill the Romans, to defend the temple? And there's quite a lot in Mark, which is basic, and we're going to get to it, where very explicitly, Jesus says, don't do that. You can tell that's the live issue for Mark's people right now.
Okay, interesting. And I guess with, spoiler alert, and I can't remember whether it comes up specifically in Mark, we will do it the next episode, looking at Good Friday and so on. But when Jesus is taken away and someone tries to defend, one of the disciples cuts off the ear of the soldier.
Right.
Don't take up a sword and all that kind of stuff. And
he says that many times in different places, and he's going to do it again right now in the next couple verses, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Like this is a digression, but it's an important one about quite often I get this all the time, because I believe that followers of Jesus, killing a human being to solve a problem is off the table for followers of the way of Jesus, right? And so you say that to Christians, and they'll right away say things like, yeah, but what about if a foreigner invades your land, or what about to defend your property? And I'm like, well, when Jesus said don't kill people, the context, he was talking about foreigners who've invaded your land and are taking your property. So I don't know what else to tell you. It wasn't like all these Christians, these modern day Christians, they think that it's like some exception. Like, well, I obviously don't follow Jesus when it comes to my land and my property. Like, no, your land and your property was the thing he was talking about when he said these things.
And essentially that's defense, isn't it? That's talking about, it's,
Yeah.
Do not, most counter argument would be, well, surely it's okay to defend oneself, essentially, whether that's defend one's property or defend one's land. It's a defense.
Well, yeah, I mean, and then we can have a longer conversation about the difference between killing your enemy and defending yourself. So I think it's the use of lethal violence is what we really are looking at. Like, because what people want to do is kill their enemies and wipe them off the face of the earth. And that seems to be the action that Jesus is very strongly says you shouldn't do.
So if we were to park that for a moment to allow us to go back into the apocalyptic language of Mark 13.
Yeah. But it is kind of here, right? Because he's even saying to his disciples, like, don't lose your tiny minds. When you see war, when you see nations rising and falling, when you see all these things happen, don't run around scared. Don't lose your head. It's a very kind of like pointed, like, your world is going to end. Don't lose your mind over it.
Yeah.
Watch out for yourselves, verse 9. People are going to persecute you. They will hand you over to councils. You will be beaten in the synagogues. Like, all these things are going to happen that normally your rights would say, well, I got to defend myself, or I got to kill my enemies. And he's like, this will happen to you, but you will stand before governors and kings so that you can testify before them. By the way, these are things that happened that came true in the book of Acts.
Okay.
Just worth pointing out. Right? When Jesus is saying these things in verse 9 and 10, the people reading them are like, yeah, that happens.
Yeah.
That happened to us, or it's happening now.
So the reason I said that earlier about parking it is not because I didn't think it was there, but it's more to, if people wanted to find out more, where would you recommend they go in terms of, in both sides, one person supporting that line of argument, where would be the one book to pick up?
Oh, the best one is this guy named Richard Hayes, The Moral Vision of the New Testament. That's the best one. He wrote a whole chapter on violence in the Gospels.
Okay.
It's really good. Yeah, it's really good.
Great.
Yeah.
And then for the counter argument, the kind of the just war argument, if there is a good one.
Well, he talks about that as well.
Okay. All right.
I mean, there isn't one in the New Testament. Like, there isn't one. And so there isn't like this kind of, oh, all sides are equal. It's like, well, no, there's just war argument, which is all post New Testament. The just war argument has all come out of Christians who find themselves in charge of empires and countries and are trying to figure out a way to have their cake and eat it too. Like, they're trying to figure like, well, how can we be Christian and wield the sword? Whereas in the New Testament itself, there's no expectation that Christians will be in charge of these countries and these empires. Mm. So even the things where Paul talks about the sword is there to hurt, the sword is for wielding justice, and he's not assuming that Christians are going to be holding it. And in fact, in Romans 12 and 13, he tells Christians, don't do this. Don't seek vengeance. Vengeance is for Caesar and his sword. So he clearly thinks there's like a difference between what the government is doing with its sword and what Christians are supposed to do.
Okay.
But then that gets lost as Christendom develops, and as Christians become powerful, they start to develop the just war theory.
Okay.
But that's not in the New Testament itself.
Yeah. Okay.
All the violence, there's a lot of violence, of course, but there's a lot of more work to be done on that. And the book of Revelations is another good one. Revelation is a very violent text, but if you look at it, the Christians never actually do any of it. They're watching it happen, but they're not doing it themselves. And there's a lot of that kind of subtle differences which you have to pay attention to.
Okay. So chapter 13, how do we as Christians in 2021 engage with this kind of apocalyptic language? I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I don't know about you, but I feel like the language around end times seems to be more heightened in the recent
Yeah.
year or whatever than
Well,
it has been in decades.
Weirdly, this chapter 13 I find is like really relevant today. Rather
Yeah.
than kind of go, oh, we have to try really hard to make it apply to us. I feel like, don't you think don't you think the teaching, when you feel like your world is coming to an end, don't lose your tiny mind. Don't you think that's actually quite relevant today?
Yeah. Yeah.
when you see utter upheaval, when all the things that you've managed, like he's going to go in, he's talking about fathers are going to turn against their children, and just it's the idea is that like all the things you thought were normal are going to be upended. And he's just saying, don't lose heart, don't be a part of the problem, don't start killing. When you see everybody killing each other, don't start doing that as well. I'm the dividing line. Like everyone will hate you because of me, but whoever stands firm to the end will be saved.
Yeah.
Salvation lies with me. Like it's a bit like that poem, if you can hold your head when everyone else around you is losing theirs. It's a little bit like that. It's kind of like salvation. I am the way of salvation. And the whole world is going to go to rack and ruin, and it is going to rack and ruin all the time. But
so is Jesus here talking in one way about almost about two things? One is orientated around the collapse, the fall of the temple in AD 70.
Yeah.
And one, he's talking the same way, but about two of, and one is a more eternal context. Is that what's going on here? So I guess my point is, should we be reading into nation will be raised against nation, kingdom against kingdom as something that is a mark of the end times to come? Or is it just, this is the nature in which we currently exist and have existed for centuries?
Yeah, because what happens is, so here in Mark, Jesus is talking about the end of the certainty of Israel. Like these people are living in this era where they're like certain that Israel is their rock solid foundation. And he's basically going like, no, this is going to end. But then the very same language gets used in the book of Revelation for Christians living in Rome. And in the book of Revelation, John and Jesus, who's giving the revelation, they say, don't think that this is the end of the story in Rome. This is going to end. And in the book of Daniel, it's a different context, but it's the same language. So what we actually get is apocalyptic language is being used in lots of different contexts, but it's always being used for like, this world is passing away. Like what you think is really certain and sure is going to pass away. It's going to end and a new thing is coming.
So is it more the sense that this isn't something to look out for as if it's not happening right now? This is just from the moment Jesus utters the words, this is the context in which human beings will live until it's wrapped up. It's almost like this is a descriptor of how it will always be for us as human beings until Jesus comes again.
We're always living in the end time.
We're always living, yes, exactly. But I think the way it's often read is, oh, now the coronavirus is here. No. This must be the beginning of the end times.
No, the coronavirus is just yet another example of your certainties being destroyed. And they always are being destroyed.
But don't lose your mind over it.
Don't lose your mind, because new things are always around the corner. And
that's really helpful.
You'll always hear wars and rumors of wars, right? There'll always be these things. And that's part of the story of the New Testament, is that it's not just like this one time. The apocalypse isn't this just one-off event that we're looking forward to. Apocalypse is, I've just listed 3. There's at least 3 apocalypses in the Bible itself, and actually probably more. It's an event that happens a lot.
And so this is less about us looking for the signs and more about how we live within the times that Jesus has already told us we're going to live in.
Yeah. How do you live? How do you orient yourself in a world that's always changing, and people are their identity is being completely undermined because everything they held true is being challenged. How do you live in that world? How do you stand firm to the end? Right?
So what would Jesus say to us in answer to that question?
Well, he would say, I stand firm to the end.
Hmm.
All heaven and earth will pass away, but my words won't pass away. Like, that's what he says constantly, that kind of thing. So this is where you can start to say, well, if you're a follower of Jesus, then his words they don't sort of like change according to the situation. Well, back to our violence thing. He doesn't say, love your enemies, unless it would be awkward for you if you're trying to protect your property. Love your enemies unless it's the patriotic thing to kill them. He doesn't say that. His words don't rise and fall. What he says is, the way humans work best, if you're my people, you love your enemies. That's just what you do. And it's something like that going on here as well.
Yeah, okay.
Can we talk about, I don't want to, can we talk about verse 14? Because it's one of the most mysterious verses in all the Gospels. So we should probably...
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Let's do that. But I think just to wrap that thought up, it's so helpful to think of this as a descriptor of what this world is like.
Yeah.
And less a predictor of what it will be like. It's a descriptor rather than a predictor.
It's a description of the way the reality is. It's not a prediction of something. It's a description of something right now.
Yeah.
And if you have eyes to see, like, I'm totally for being spiritually discerning, but I don't think it means like scour the newspapers and see if you can identify who the beast is.
Yeah.
It's more like going, there's always something kind of beastish about our lives. There's always something that is setting itself up against the rule of God, for example. There's always, and these regimes are always coming to an end as well. So what are we going to do about it?
Yeah, but there'll be another one.
There'll be another one, and that kind of thing.
Which is true.
We're getting to the Book of Revelation talk, but there is a reason why I keep talking about Revelation, because Mark 13 and the Book of Revelation are strongly connected. Yeah.
And Mark wrote it with that in mind. He
I don't think so. No, I think it's because they're both drawing from this genre of apocalypse that I mentioned.
But also because they are both informed by the words of Jesus.
Well, exactly, because Jesus was also an apocalyptic prophet.
Yeah.
That's what he's doing.
Yeah. So the source is the same. It just so happens that Mark writes it in one place and John writes it in another.
Yeah, exactly. But that is just one of the ways that it looks and feels like to be around Jesus. It looks and feels like being around somebody who's saying the whole world is going to end, and the things that you think are really sure and foundational are going to be left with not one stone upon the other, but stand firm, because my words will last.
And in the same way that these stones will not remain, he is the cornerstone.
Yes, and we in the last couple of weeks we've been talking about Jesus as the cornerstone. He's already talked about himself that way. A few weeks ago, before that, we talked about if you're forgiving your brother, if you're in the temple and you're forgiving someone, or if you want to give your sacrifices, you need to go and forgive them. When you stand forgiving, and then Jesus immediately says, and then if you say to this mountain, it can be thrown into the sea, it will be. And there's a connection there of like the temple, of course, was the mountain. That was the nickname for it. And he's essentially saying, like, the way you forgive each other, if you forgive each other, that's partly what's going to make this temple be no longer necessary. And it will be thrown into the sea, which is not that different from saying not one stone will be left upon another.
Yeah, right.
It's just part of the same thing. He keeps saying again and again, like, the things that you think you need the temple for, you don't need the temple for anymore. You've got me now. And you can forgive each other and that kind of stuff. And then he directly talks about the temple here in verse 14.
Yeah, let's go on to that.
When you see the, what does yours verse say? What does DBH say for verse 14?
He says, and when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it ought not.
Yeah. And then
let the reader understand.
Yeah, which is why it's so ironic that Mark puts in one of his little paragraphs here, his little insertions, in the one verse that he assumes everybody knows what he's talking about. Now, let's point that out, that it is now one of the more mysterious verses in all four Gospels, but Mark thought that it was obvious.
Right, and I just as we've been talking, we've been looking it up in the NIV.
Yeah.
And it makes it no clearer.
No, I know. So, but to be honest, it's not that complicated. So Christians love to overcomplicate this, and they treat it like they act like it's a mystery. And they act like it's a mystery to be solved, and that it's some mysterious, they think it's the Antichrist, they think the abomination that causes desolation, they link it with the Antichrist, and they link that with the book of Revelation, which, by the way, you know that the Antichrist is never mentioned in the book of Revelation, right? Doesn't appear once. The Antichrist only appears in some of the letters of John, and it means the person who denies that Jesus came in the flesh. But what Christians have done, if they've taken the abomination that causes desolation, and they've taken the beast in Revelation,
the
Antichrist, and they put it all together, and there's a man of lawlessness that Paul talks about, and they put them all together, and they've created this comic book villain.
Yeah, right.
Like a Thanos or somebody. But that's not what's going on here. And the abomination that causes desolation, if your answer to this is not obvious, then you're not reading it correctly, because Mark thinks it's obvious. And it really doesn't take more than a 5-minute Google search when you realize that there were Roman governors that would set up statues of themselves in the temple in order to show their dominance over the temple. So obviously putting a statue of anything in the temple when God says don't have any graven images is a bad thing. But to put a statue of yourself when you're a Gentile ruling overlord is really bad. You might even call it an abomination that desolates the temple, which is exactly what they did call it.
Standing where it ought not.
Where it ought not to. And so there was an abomination. This is an event that Mark's people know about, that Jesus's people know about. When you see the Roman governors put his statue up in the temple, now, remember I talked about how in AD 66 to AD 70, there was this call that all the loyal sons of Israel would come and defend the homeland. Well, one of the things that they were defending was that a Roman governor had put their statue up in the temple. So if you are living in AD 69 or whatever it was, and you're reading Mark, and you're Jewish, and you're a follower of Jesus, and you've heard that the Romans are desecrating the temple, and you think, well, I better get my sword and go and defend my homeland. And Jesus says, when you hear of the desolation, what does he say? Does he say, take your sword and kill the Romans?
Well, in my translation, it says, then those in Judea, let them flee into the mountains.
Flee to the mountains. Which is the exact opposite to the enormous social pressure that was on the followers of Jesus at this time. They would have been expected to do the opposite, to do the patriotic thing and to go and kill the Romans and purge the temple. And here Mark is saying, don't you remember Jesus said, flee, which is, again, remember how we had that whole thing about should we pay Caesar's taxes, Caesar's tax or not? And Caesar's tax was one of, it was, again, a patriotic thing of like, if we resist Caesar's tax because the tax is being used, he's charging us for the right to worship in our own temple. And to refuse to pay the tax was to the patriotic thing. And Jesus, one of the things he says is pay the tax because we've got other things to worry about.
Yeah, okay.
Now here's another patriotic call to protect the temple. And Jesus says, run away. Right? Like he's not hitting the notes that a really good freedom fighter, patriotic leader is supposed to hit.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then he says, flee and you shouldn't come back, and it's going to be terrible for women who are pregnant. Again, there's linking women with childbirth. In those days, there'll be great suffering. So, he's saying, look, it's not, again, one of the things I think we're looking at is that people had this triumphalistic idea that like Jesus is establishing his kingdom and it's all going to be rosebuds and Coca-Cola from here on in.
And he's in Jerusalem at this point, isn't he?
Yeah.
And it seems that the crowd, you can imagine the crowd is gradually getting more and more disillusioned with the freedom fighter that is Jesus, because he's not saying the things that they want him to say.
Yeah. And he's not ushering in. So this is one of those weird things where it's like people really wanted Israel to be restored. The Messiah was the one that's supposed to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus basically goes, well, I am a Messiah. I'm just not what you were expecting. And Israel will be restored, but it just isn't going to look like what you think it's going to look like. And so this is part of that, right? Because they want the people who are going to clear out the temple and kill the Romans and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And he doesn't do that. And he says, but watch out, I've told you everything ahead of time. And then in verse 24, he really goes into apocalyptic overdrive. And I think you can get really hung up on this. The sun will become dark and the moon will, the stars will fall out of the sky. It's if you realize that this isn't the first time anybody's heard this kind of language, it changes it. He's using genre language.
Yeah.
And I've used this as an example before, like remember when the Berlin Wall fell? What year did the Berlin Wall fall?
89.
89, right? Now, in 1989, there were like newspaper headlines going, the fall of the Berlin Wall has sent shockwaves around Europe.
Yeah, yeah.
But so I can imagine in 2,000 years' time, somebody uncovering that newspaper and they read that headline and they go, wow, that must have been a really big wall.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because they've over literalized the thing.
Right.
It is true. The fall of the Berlin Wall did send shockwaves around Europe, but it wasn't literal.
Right.
And that's similar language to this moon and stars falling out of the sky. Because it's not an actual prediction of actual stars falling out of the sky. It's the language you use when you say your whole world is going to end. Things are not going to be in the right order anymore.
Yeah.
That the fall is going to send shockwaves around Europe. It's that kind of language. And so it's apocalyptic. It's totally well known and well understood by the people who hear it. Mark doesn't need to explain it because.
Yeah. And it's helpful to think of, because often, when you first come to the Bible, as I was actually having this conversation with my kids just the other day, I said, do you know what the word, I was teaching about context, the ones I was talking to were only between the ages of 6 and 11.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the importance of context. And one of those contexts when we read the Bible is that Bible comes from the word biblio, which means library. And
right.
And every, there's 66 books and there's lots of, and my oldest got it and we worked it out. And, but it's also helpful to think in terms of that each book might have a variety of genres within it.
Yeah.
And again, that's a really important contextual thing.
Yeah.
That I think if I'm honest, I'll read Mark's gospel. I'm aware enough to read Mark's gospel different than I might read the Psalms or even something like Revelation. But I would read it consistently the same. Whereas it's really important to realize that as we're reading even the same book, there may be a switch in tone because of the genre and because of how we're reading it.
Well, think of Jesus as like he's enacting political theater. So think of like when he comes into Jerusalem on a donkey, not on a war horse.
Mm-hmm.
Think of when he overturns the temple tables. Like he's doing stuff so that people can see him do it. Right? He's very self-consciously adopting a role. And every once in a while in the Gospels, he'll even tell you, he's like, do this so that we can fulfill the scriptures. And here he's adopting a voice and a role of an apocalyptic prophet.
Mm-hmm.
And he even drives the point home because at the very end of this story, was it verse 26, he says, look, all the stars and moon are going to change places and everything's going to fall out of the sky. And then they will see the human one or the Son of Man come in the clouds with great power. Well, do you know where that's from?
Daniel, surely.
Yeah. And Daniel is the other great apocalyptic.
Yeah.
That is what Daniel's all about. And now Jesus is once again linking himself to Daniel.
Yeah. Okay.
Himself to this figure, the Son of Man figure, who's this one. Another way to say it is just the human being who has been given in the Daniel story. It's the human one has come and is given authority. The Lord says, "Come sit at my right hand," and he gives him authority over all the nations.
Yeah.
So Jesus says, "Hey, the world that you put a lot of stock in is ending, but here I am. I'm the king of the world." Right? And he makes himself the fulfillment of the prophecy of the apocalypse fulfillment in Daniel.
Yeah.
He puts himself in that story. It's very deliberate. He's very overt. He's very public about it. He's like, "Hey, everyone, the end of your world has come, but don't worry. I'm the one that Daniel talked about. I'm the human one who's been given all divine authority over all the nations."
Because that's, again, yet another context that's critical for us to hear.
Yeah.
Is that the scripture in their hand was what we call our Old Testament. I know it's really basic to say, but they would have known it.
And he's adopting language that they absolutely knew. They're not.
Yeah.
Now it's a mysterious. It's like a controversial thing to do, to call yourself the Son of Man, but it's not mysterious, if that makes sense.
Right.
It wasn't like everyone was doing it. You're making a big statement. You're really swinging. Right, you're really going for 6 when you say that. But he's not making it up. And then he says, so then, and do you remember we were talking all about the temple and everything and all that stands for, and it's about the redemption of Israel? Well, the Son of Man is going to come, and he will send angels and to gather together his chosen people from the 4 corners of the earth, from the end of the earth to the end of heaven. Chosen people are more than just what you think they are, right? The whole thing ends with the Son of Man is given authority over all the nations, and he's going to make chosen people out of all the nations.
Yeah.
It's not about just protecting the temple and all that happens.
Yes. Which then opens the door to Gentiles.
Yeah.
Being part of that.
This is totally part of the Gentile mission, which the early church will go for in a big way. And it'll take a few more revelations from Jesus.
Yeah, but it's offensive. He's talking about the destruction of the temple. And not only that, but the people who God has chosen includes more than just them.
Yeah.
And, in one apocalyptic speech, he's gone from them saying what a great building and all it represents of Jewish culture and so on, to saying, well, hang on a minute, this is going to come and not one brick will remain. And oh, by the way, there'll be people that you currently find offensive joining you in that. And that
will feel like the end of the world.
Yeah.
Right. That's the point. That is the point. It's like, your world of clearly defined racial boundaries and purity laws will come to an end.
Yeah.
And that is the current reality of the early Christians. They live in that world right now.
Yeah.
When Mark is written, of Jews and Gentiles in one place, worshiping Jesus in one building.
So before we come to a close, I'd love to just talk about one verse.
Oh, yeah.
Which is Amen, which is truly, truly, or however you want to translate it. In my version, it says Amen. I tell you that this generation most certainly does not pass away until all these things happen. Yeah. So it feels like at first reading, there's a time point here, which is why people get muddied about where does this fit on the kind of eternal timescale, these words of Jesus. And how do we read a verse like that? It's very specific about this generation.
Well, but it's not a mystery. If you realize that parts of your world is always ending and new worlds are always beginning, well, it's happened. In your generation, it's going to happen. The world is going to end, but a new one is coming.
Yeah.
I tell you that your generation is going to see this happen. And they did, right?
Yes, okay.
He's just described Gentiles being named as chosen people. Well, guess what Gentiles called themselves when they were sitting in Mark's church in AD 70 and 80? Like, this isn't some sort of mysterious passage that, oh my gosh, Jesus predicted something and it didn't come true, so now what do we do? It's like, he's just talking about a thing that they were experiencing in the moment when they read it.
Yeah. Okay.
That generation didn't pass away. And, you know, if you think about it, it's like the disciples, the people who knew Jesus, he's looking at them going, everything's going to pass away, and people from all corners of the earth are going to call themselves chosen people. And now Peter is an old man, and he's dying, or he's just died, and he's passed on his words to Mark, and Mark writes them down. He's like, that happened within one generation.
Yeah. Okay.
Very
helpful.
It's a description of what happened. It's not a mysterious prediction that we have to try really hard to figure out whether it came true or not.
And the end of Jesus' words here says, "Be vigilant, therefore, for you do not know when the Lord of the household comes."
Yeah.
Be vigilant.
Yeah.
And it goes back to for me, it goes back to the very beginnings of Mark's gospel. This idea of "come and follow me."
Very much.
That your trust cannot be in the bricks of the temple, or in your political power, or in your religious affiliation, or whatever. Your trust has to be in me. And when Jesus said, "Come follow me," we're placing our trust not in a set of events that are to come, but in a person who knows.
Yeah, you trust in his way.
Yeah, but you may not know where that may lead, but you trust in him.
Yeah, exactly. And you don't make decisions. You don't say, well, I'll only follow Jesus' way if it succeeds, or if it gets me what I need, or what I want, or what I think I want. And he's saying, no, my way is your end point. You do my way, you follow my words, even if it turns brother against father or whatever.
Yeah.
But that's a test that we fail all the time as followers. We always treat Jesus' words as if they're just one word amongst many, which we can kind of weigh and figure out when we want to follow them or not, based on whether we think it works or not.
Yeah.
But
well, we're going to close chapter 13 there. We're going to begin chapter 14. But for this episode, we're going to close. I'm going to pray for us.
Good. Let's do it.
Lord, I thank you for that reminder that we place our trust in you, that we live in times that are often uncertain. We think particularly at the moment for us as a global community. And yet these things will pass away. This age will end and a new age will come, but we are still to place our trust in you. Help us, Lord, we pray, to do exactly that, to place our trust not in the things of this world, but in you. Come, Lord Jesus, and change our hearts. Amen. Well, Stephen, thank you so much for another great episode, and we'll see you soon.